The opposition. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that the West Australian Liberal Premier has confirmed that the Liberal Party is preferencing one nation at the forthcoming West Australian state election? Will the Prime Minister advise the Premier of Western Australia to put one nation last in every seat?
Members on both sides, just before I call the Prime Minister, I've listened carefully to the Leader of the Opposition's question. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. And as the practice makes clear, questions that go beyond the responsibilities of ministers are out of order. Page 554 of the practice. Members on my left, the member for Griffith, already we're not even a minute or so in. I'm going to explain my position to the House. Page 554 of practice makes it very clear that ministers can only be questioned on matters for which they're responsible. And no minister is responsible for the subject matter of the question, that being the Leader of or the Premier of Western Australia or the state party referred to in Western Australia. Now I'm going to give the Manager of Opposition Business the call on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I simply ask you to reflect on a precedent that was set on the 31st of October 2000, where if you hear the words of the question that then Opposition Leader Kim Beazley asked then Prime Minister John Howard, it is almost identical to what's just been put. The question was, my question is to the Prime Minister, is the Prime Minister aware that Western Australian Liberal Premier Richard Court has left open the possibility of the Liberal Party preferencing one nation at the forthcoming Western Australian state election? Will the Prime Minister advise Premier Court to adopt the same position that the Prime Minister reluctantly adopted at the 1998 federal election, namely to put one nation last in every seat? The question is almost identical, and if
members on my
well,
right.
that's true. The Premier's name's not Richard Court anymore. But other than
let's
that,
keep moving.
Other than that, if it was good enough for John Howard to answer, this Prime Minister should answer as well.
Members on my left and right, I'm going to address this matter very quickly. And whilst the Manager of Opposition Business has obviously done some detailed research on the history of Hansard, the practice is very clear, and I'm going to make a couple of points, because whilst that question was clearly allowed, and in that case the Prime Minister obviously wished to answer it, and I can tell that's probably the case today. But I've ruled on this matter. Members on my left, I've ruled on this matter in some detail and reflected on it since the beginning of this parliament. And within a couple of weeks of the beginning of this parliament, the member for Solomon asked a question to the Prime Minister that I deemed out of order on the basis it was about the Chief Minister in the Northern Territory and a donation, I think, from Gina Reinhardt, for memory. But I made it very clear that it did not go to the Prime Minister's responsibilities, and notwithstanding the fact he wished to answer on that occasion, I made it clear, as far as I was concerned as Speaker, we couldn't allow questions out of order to be asked. So I'm maintaining that ruling. The member for Banks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's energy policies will keep power bills affordable and improve security for hard-working Australian families and businesses, including in my electorate of Banks?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Like all honourable members, Mr Speaker, the honourable member has businesses in his electorate that depend upon affordable and reliable energy. Secure power is absolutely critical. Affordable power is absolutely critical, as it is for households, Mr Speaker.
Member for
and
Wakefield.
honourable members will understand when they speak to their constituents how shocked they are by the doubling of energy prices over the last decade. Overwhelmingly, the consequence of Labor Party policies that put ideology ahead of pragmatic, business-like approaches to energy. The reality is that the Labor Party today stands for unreliable power, unaffordable power. That is the package they are presenting, and we see the most graphic proof of that in South Australia. Mr Speaker, wherever I go in Australia, I meet with Australians who are battling higher and higher energy prices, whether it was the workers at the Viridian glass plant in Dandenong, whether it was the tuna fishermen in Port Lincoln, whether it was the workers at Nowchem in Gilmore, the honourable member, on Friday, a family-owned chemical and pharmaceutical business that is being battered by higher and higher energy prices right across the board. Portland Aluminium, another excellent example, a business whose major input is energy, and it has been going through the roof because of the Labor Party's ideologically driven approach to energy prices. Mr Speaker, we see what has happened in South Australia. The proof is there. It is absolutely clear. State Labor governments pursuing unachievable, unaffordable renewable targets with no plan to secure supply at all. We have set out the roadmap to do that, an objective, technology-agnostic approach that will give us three things: affordable energy, reliable energy, and will meet our emissions reduction targets. Labor can't do that, and that's why, Mr Speaker, the opposition leaders in South Australia, Victoria and Queensland have been right in pledging that they will abandon their Labor state government's unrealistic renewables targets, because those targets will cripple the businesses of their states, and it will place continuing indefensible pressure on household budgets. That's the price of Labor's assault on households and businesses.
The Prime Minister's time has expired. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that in the last few months One Nation has stated that being a single parent is a lifestyle choice which leads to an increase in ugly and lazy people? The Port Arthur massacre was faked and the 9/11 terrorist attack was a hoax. In the light of these statements, does the Prime Minister agree with his Industry Minister who said, and I quote, "The One Nation of today is a very different beast to what it was 20 years ago. They are a lot more sophisticated." And how much influence does One Nation have on government policy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. No doubt this causes the honourable member great discomfort when he reflects that the member for Herbert wouldn't be sitting in this parliament were it not for One Nation preferences.
Members on my right, members on both sides. Leader of the House, the member for CORANGAMITE. The member for WRIGHT has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House how the government is working to reduce cost of living pressures for hard-working Australians? And is the Treasurer aware of any comments supporting an internationally competitive economy and tax system in order to protect the living standards of all Australians?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Member
I
for
thank the
Grindler.
member for his question.
The member
I
for
particularly
Grindler.
thank him for his key role in organising the A50 event in Sydney last Friday and Thursday, which brought $17 trillion of funds under management by those who came to Australia last week. So well done. It's an excellent initiative, and that member would be aware of the remarks made by the Reserve Bank Governor on Thursday night. And before I draw attention to those comments, I draw attention to the comments by the Shadow Treasurer on the 7th of October of 2009 in an interview he gave with Ross Greenwood, and he said, "One of the weapons in the armoury of the Reserve Bank is the signal that they send. The signal that they send through those sorts of public speeches, etc., and that is often very significant." The Governor makes no apologies for using that, and I think that's appropriate. Now, Mr Speaker, the Governor of the Reserve Bank had a message for the member opposite Mr Speaker last Thursday night when he said, "We need to make sure that our tax system is internationally competitive. One example of this complication is in the area of corporate tax, where there is a form of international tax competition going on in an effort to attract foreign investment. Like other countries, we face the challenge of responding to this while achieving a balance between recurrent spending and fiscal revenue. Mr Speaker, this government is responding to that challenge. Those opposite are frustrating the government from responding to that challenge. Those opposite have run out of excuses as to why they refuse to support a policy in this place that they themselves advocated when they were in government, Mr Speaker. But they had other excuses. Their other excuses was that apparently we can't afford it. But, Mr Speaker, when the Leader of the Opposition said that we should be the benefits to investment and growth from lower company tax rates, when he made that speech, the deficit was $41.5 billion and rising, Mr Speaker. And none less than the Shadow Treasurer said this: the United Kingdom, facing a much tougher fiscal situation than Australia, cut its corporate tax rate to 23% in April of 2013 to be reduced further. Now, today the Shadow Treasurer says the Reserve Bank Governor's got it all wrong because such a thing as dividend imputation. Well, it wasn't introduced yesterday, Shadow Treasurer. It's been around for a long time. When you were arguing for company tax cuts, and Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we know that that change is necessary for businesses to be able to remain competitive and to support the jobs of those who work for them. Those opposite are quite happy to loll around in corporate boardrooms when they're in government and talk up to the business community and say, oh, we're all for changing corporate tax rates. But when it doesn't suit them, like we know with this Leader of Opposition and those who sit across the opposition front bench, they change their tune when the politics dictate. The only reason, Mr Speaker, those who are opposed to the changes that are going to make Australian businesses competitive, Mr Speaker, is their political opportunities.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. One Nation has called for Australia to end its membership of the United Nations, and just last week Senator Pauline Hanson dismissed concerns over Vladimir Putin's role in the deaths of almost 300 people, including 38 Australians on flight MH17. What does this say about the government's approach to foreign policy when a member of Cabinet describes a party with this approach as sophisticated? Have any diplomatic posts raised concerns about Senator Hanson's influence?
Hear, hear. The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for her question. I really do think it is a bit rich for Labor to be lecturing us on one nation preferences when the member for DeBell was elected on those preferences. I also think it's a bit rich.
Members on my left.
Let alone all the people elected over there on
the Leader of the House.
Yes, exactly.
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, Minister for Foreign Affairs will resume her seat. The Leader of the House and the Minister for Immigration and numerous people on my left are preventing the Minister from answering the question that's been asked. I won't tolerate this level of interjection any further throughout the answer. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I think it's pretty rich for the member for Sydney to seek to lecture us on preferences that are determined by the state divisions when the Labor Party unquestioningly accepts Green preferences, does deals with the Greens, in fact entered into a coalition with the Greens, who has a view of one world government, who wants to tear up the US-Australia alliance,
member for McMahon,
and who would have to represent the most dangerous political train of thought in Australian politics. Labor unquestioningly does deals with the Greens. They are the risk to foreign policy in this country, a Labor-Greens coalition.
The member for Denison. Member for Denison has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, your personal commitment to health care is compromised by the freeze on the Medicare rebate for a visit to the GP. Indeed, yours is a regressive policy that burdens the poor because the freeze is driving down bulk billing rates. This is just plain dumb because primary care, at 7% of the health budget, is not the cause of health care inflation. It's actually what helps keep people out of expensive hospitals. Tasmania is being slugged especially hard because bulk billing was down another 2% there in the last quarter, even though we're the most disadvantaged and sickest state. Prime Minister, please will you immediately lift the freeze on the Medicare rebate for a visit to a GP?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. And the government is committed to ensuring that all Australians, all Tasmanians, and all members of the honourable member's electorate, in fact, have access to high-quality health care when they need it, whether it's seeing the GP, getting medications or tests, or needing hospital care. My government is delivering record levels of health funding, and this continues to grow every year. Now, as far as the Medicare freeze on the indexation is concerned, we are open to reviewing that indexation pause, which was begun by members opposite when they were in government. And the Minister for Health is having productive discussions with the AMA and the colleges as to how that can be achieved. But clearly, we are managing a very tight budgetary position. We need to ensure that we get as much value from our health dollar, in value I mean in terms of better outcomes for patients, as we can. Now, in terms of Tasmania, I'd say to the honourable member, across Tasmania there have been an extra 1.03 million more GP services billed in the last year than compared to 2012-13. In the honourable member's electorate, there have been an extra 76,000 GP bulk billed services in the last 12 months compared to 2012-13. So more Tasmanians are seeing a GP without having to pay for it. Those are the facts.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Denison on a point of order.
Well, Speaker, on a point of order, I'm concerned that the Prime Minister could be misleading the chamber here. Bulk billing in Tasmania is down, and that's a fact. The member for
Denison will resume his seat. That is not a valid point of order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, now the honourable member would be well aware of the importance of providing better and more effective support at the primary healthcare level, the GP level, to people with chronic diseases. Our healthcare homes trials are a very important part of that, because the honourable member knows doctors will be rewarded for treating a patient in a much more holistic way rather than episodically. It's a very important trial. There are 10 regions where it's being rolled out, and Tasmania is one of them. So we are giving Tasmanians the opportunity to participate in that. Now, of course, all Australians have access to many medicines at much cheaper prices due to our national reforms to the pharmaceutical benefit schemes. We've added life-saving drugs, including for breast cancer and melanoma, which mean that Tasmanians and all Australians, indeed, who need those medications, which could cost $100,000 per treatment, can now access them for only $38.80 for general patients and $6.30 for concessional patients. So, Mr Speaker, I assure the honourable member that at every level we are spending more on health care. We are doing everything we can to ensure that all Australians and all the constituents of the honourable members are getting the best health care possible, and ensuring that our health care dollar goes as far as it can to ensure they live healthy and active lives.
Just before I call the member for Tangney, I'd like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Right Honourable Nick Herbert, member of the House of Commons for Arundel and South Downs. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Tangney.
My question is to the Minister for Environment and Energy. Will the Minister update the House on how a coordinated national approach to energy policy is supporting secure and affordable energy for hard-working Australian families and businesses? How does this compare with alternative approaches?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Tangney for his question and acknowledge his deep commitment to getting better energy policy across the country and ensuring the lights stay on. Now, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has laid out a clear plan for our energy policy. First and foremost, energy security, energy affordability as we transition to a lower emissions future, and taking the ideology out of the policy. Now, Mr Speaker, we understand that renewables are an important part of the energy mix. In fact, just 18 months ago there was bipartisan support for a renewable energy target, which the member for Port Adelaide said would restore investor confidence, Mr Speaker. But you can't have increased renewables without increased storage, and that's why this government is prioritising storage projects, and the Prime Minister has outlined our emphasis on pump hydro, and we've directed ARENA and the CFC to invest in these projects, and more than $100 million has been flowing to storage projects, like a project in South Australia which is linking 1,000 homes and businesses with batteries and solar PV to create a virtual power plant, like the work that we're doing with the ANU to map out future sites for pumped hydro across the country. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked, am I aware of any alternative approaches? Well, we know that the Labor states of South Australia and Queensland have 50% renewable targets, and we know that Victoria has a 40% target, and we know that the Leader of the Opposition wants to take this madness national with his 50% target. But we also know that when they were rushing last week after the blackout in South Australia to blame the operator, they started to trip over themselves. And the member for Sydney, who struggles to get a question up here, put out a tweet during question time asking me to turn on the gas, in South Australia. Now, I thought to myself, maybe she didn't listen to the member for Wakefield earlier that day when you thought the federal government could provide the answer, because this is what the member for Wakefield said on Sky. I understand the federal minister has no powers
the Minister for Environment and Energy will resume his seat for a second. The Minister will resume his seat for a second. The member for McMahon is warned. The member for Melbourne on a point of order.
On relevance, the minister might like to know about solar power. It does quite well during a heat wave.
Member for Melbourne will resume his seat. Member for Melbourne will resume his seat. His microphone's not on. I just inform members on both sides. I say to the member for Melbourne and the member for Denison, as I said to the Treasurer last week, they know the rules on props. Please place the prop on the table, and I'd like to address the House. The member for Melbourne will resume his seat. I've got to inform the member for Melbourne, as far as anyone watching is concerned, he's on mute. As soon as I say resume your seat, the microphone goes off. I'd like to now address the House. Minister will resume his seat. The member for Barker will cease interjecting. I'd like to address the House without interruption. In fact, I will without interruption. Anyone interrupting will be dealt with. Last Thursday, I've got to say an undesirable prop was used here in the House, and this has occurred again today. If you look at the history of our parliamentary debate, this has occurred from time to time. But I'm just giving fair warning now. The member for Port Adelaide, I'm giving fair warning now. This is not going to become a regular occurrence in the House. So, like a game of musical chairs, that's it. And any further repetition of it, I'll need to deal with. And as I said, it's happened from time to time, but it's not going to become a regular feature of question time. I say to the Deputy Prime Minister, who's mid-conversation, I find it quite unbecoming for the House, and it's not going to become a regular feature of question time. The Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I wonder if the member for Melbourne knows that it takes 220 tonnes of coking coal to make a wind turbine, Mr Speaker. 220 tonnes of coking coal to make a wind turbine. Now, and a dozen metals and minerals to make a solar panel, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Port Adelaide, the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Sydney, the member for Watson, they don't have any idea who the Australian energy market operator is. They don't have any idea what the powers of the federal government are. They don't have any idea what the state government's responsibilities are. And they don't have any idea what the impact on households and businesses are of blackouts. In fact, the member for Port Adelaide flippantly described those blackouts in South Australia as a hiccup.
The member for Hunter.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, because today he said of the WA One Nation preference deal, and I quote, This is a disappointing move. I hope the architects of it clearly understand the ramifications of the decision. Given the Federal Minister for Finance was closely involved in the negotiations, has the Finance Minister ever conducted legislation negotiations in the Senate with One Nation on behalf of the Deputy Prime Minister or any other National Party ministers? Is the Deputy Prime Minister happy to have the Minister for Finance negotiating with One Nation on his behalf?
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. I've ruled one question out of order on the subject matter. I've allowed another two in. That question is in the category of the first question asked. It's out of order. I'm ruling it out. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
I respect the ruling that you've made. Can you make clear just
maybe the
what
Manager
it
of
is that's
Opposition
making
Business
it out
might
of
go
order?
to the point that he thinks he's in order, because I'm glad he concedes that most of it is out of order. If he goes to the point that he thinks is in order.
The fact that it is asking about legislation negotiations in the Senate and the minister's role in who he delegates to conduct those legislation negotiations in the Senate.
No, I'll allow the Deputy Prime Minister to answer that narrow part of the question, any other point he deems fit.
Well, I thank the member for Hunter for his apt question about agriculture. I'm always waiting for a question on agriculture or water from the member for Hunter. I think what would be better would to get a question on energy security, since he is the member for Hunter. And last time I went through there was actually a power station or a couple that he might want to keep open, just like the member for Shorten might want to keep their power stations open. But of course they don't believe in keeping their power stations open. They keep on believing anything but the questions that are actually pertinent either to their portfolio or to the actual area they live. Now, to the area of what are the effects of preference deals and how they affect legislation, well, that is a very pertinent question for the member for Herbert, who got in on One Nation preferences, and the member for Longman, who got in on One Nation preferences, and the member for Dobell, who got in on One Nation preferences. So we have rather a confusion of how
Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. Deputy Prime Minister resume his seat. Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for McEwen on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It goes to direct relevance. Now, in 2010,
the member for McEwen will resume his seat. Member for McEwen will resume his seat. I made it very clear when I allowed this question that I would allow the Deputy Prime Minister to answer the question and any other matter he deemed fit. The gate is open. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you very much. And I take the point of order, and it was kind of irrelevant. Started badly, faded away a bit in the middle, and the less said about the end of it, the better. So, but what we actually see with the Labor Party is that they will completely avoid the issue that is pertinent to how you actually get working men and women back into work. Working men and women back into work, because you have a choice. You can either have cheap labour or cheap power. Now, they don't believe in cheap power. They don't believe in actually looking after the working men and women. And the member for Shorten knows that, and the member for Shorten will know that he's now on camera, and he has to explain to his constituency why he's become a patsy for the Greens. Why he's become a patsy for the Greens? Because he probably got Green preferences, the member for Shorten. He would have got Green preferences, and he's now been determined, his whole political agenda within the Labor Party has been determined by Green preferences. As with the member for Hunter, who no doubt got Green preferences. He's very proud of those Green preferences, because I know to his bootstraps, he believes in the Green agenda. He believes in the Green agenda. And of course, I know one person, that's the member for Grainler. I mean, he almost is a Green member. I mean, he just sits there. He has to get the Daily Telegraph to go into bat for him. The Daily Telegraph to go and save Albo from the Greens, because the Labor Party's been taken over by the Greens. The Labor Party is a paid-up member of the Australian Greens. Yet we never hear about what their policy agenda is. Remember, it's the Greens who want to get rid of coal mining completely. Send our whole nation down the financial tube. But they don't care about that. The Labor Party doesn't care about that. They've been overtaken. The problem with the Labor Party these days, Mr. Speaker, is the Labor Party doesn't have any people who actually ever did any labour in it. There's no one who actually did any labour. There's no actual workers in it anymore. They've sort of given up on workers and taken up on union officials and university students. That's what the Labor Party is, union officials and university students. You don't have the people who are actually the sharers, who are actually the workmen and women.
Just before I give the call to the Manager of Opposition Business, the member for Wakefield's warned, as is the member for Shorten and Morton, and the member for Griffith's already been warned. That's her final warning. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. In his answer, the Deputy Prime Minister referred to documents from the electorates of Herban, Longman and Dobell, the how-to votes that were handed out. I'd seek leave to table all three how-to votes, all of which have Labor putting One Nation last.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. Member for Murray will resume his seat. The member for Bendigo is warned. The member for Griffith couldn't help herself. She'll leave under 94A. And the member for Murray has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of energy security and affordability to hard-working regional Australians, particularly in the agricultural industries? Can the Minister outline any obstacles to securing the jobs and productivity of Australia's $60 billion agricultural sector?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. Australia has the most efficient irrigators in the world, and there's no better example of that than the Goulburn Murray Valleys and the member's own electorate. We've seen leading food processors like SPC and Kagome, innovative operators like Kai Valley Dairy exporting liquid milk to Asia, a range of high-value horticultural apples, pears, stone fruits, grapes, wines. It's the home of Rubicon, the world's leader in efficient irrigation equipment. The Commonwealth has invested, as part of this process, over $1 billion in more efficient irrigation infrastructure in the Murray-Goulburn region. And the Prime Minister is to be commended at being the instigator at starting that process of getting a better and efficient irrigation so we can get a better return back through the farm gate. And we're investing right now in Australia. On Saturday we announced the Duck Irrigation Scheme in Tasmania, where we're actually building dams, we're actually building water infrastructure. The $30 million project at Circular Head will provide 5,200 megalitres of high-security water to support dairy production as well as production of crops like potatoes, onions and carrots. But there's one thing you need for efficient irrigation, and that is you need affordable power. And whether it's in the Burdekin or whether it's in Victoria, the Murray-Goulburn, or whether it's in Tasmania, if you can't afford the power to lift the water, then you can't have an irrigation system. And it was interesting to see in the Riverlands in South Australia, Premier Jay Weatherall goes down there to kick up a stink about water policy, and all the farmers could tell him was the stink they've got in power policy, that they can't even afford to lift the water. In fact, they said quite clearly to him, it's no good talking about water if we can't pump it. And of course, where does the instigation of this dilemma come from? Well, it comes from the crazy ideas that the Labor Party has absorbed from the Australian Greens in that sort of triumvirate of trying to make, with Australian Greens and others, that triumvirate of trying to make sure that they abide by the wills of Johnson Street and Trafalgar Street and Annandale, the Angel of Annandale over there, and trying to look after them, and then let the whole rest of Australia go down the tubes. And what this amounts to is places such as Woollynook Farms is now using diesel power for their packing shed. They're actually having to go off the grid to supply their power. We're seeing Lindsay Point Almonds having to go off the grid to supply their power. We're finding Kingston Estate Wines having to go off the grid to supply their power. Because the submarines are actually worried about how they're going in this new submarine development. We have to worry about how we get the power. And what we have is a policy of the Australian Labor Party, and they won't come to the dispatch box to debate it. They just won't. They refuse to come to the dispatch box to debate power policy, because they are going to stand behind Middle Australia, South Australia's policy of taking Australia back to the Middle Ages, to live contented in caves, living on beetles and nuts. When is the Labor Party going to actually stand behind their own power policy?
The time has expired. The member for Jagga has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the government's announcement today that it will use $3 billion it wants to cut from families, pensioners and new mums to fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Given the Prime Minister's cuts have little chance of passing the Parliament, will he be cutting $3 billion from the NDIS? Why is the Prime Minister threatening to cut the NDIS instead of scrapping his $50 billion handout to big business? What sort of callous, uncaring and out-of-touch government
member's
is
time
this
has
Prime
expired. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government I lead can count, which is more than you can say for the government the honourable member was a member of. Mr Speaker, the NDIS, all members of this House, this Parliament, support the NDIS, but it has to be paid for. And the Labor
member
government
for Jagga has asked her.
massively
The member for
unfunded.
Jagga has asked her question.
Is ensuring that measure after measure is putting funds to support the NDIS. That's what we're doing, and I'll ask the Minister to expand on that, because what we're doing is acting responsibly. The Labor Party, reckless as ever, foreseeing the solution in debt and deficit rather than in prudent economic management.
The Minister for Social
Mr.
Services.
Speaker, since coming to government in 2013, we have consistently and accurately noted that the Labor Party left a funding gap for the NDIS in the year 2020, which starts at $4 billion and grows very rapidly after that. Now, there were three ways that you can pay for that funding gap. You can find savings in the budget, you can borrow more money, or you can increase taxes. That funding gap will be met, but our very strong preference is to find savings. And for members opposite who still try and maintain this bizarre myth that it was fully funded, let me read to you the best and last explanation that was given by the member for Jagga as to that funding gap. When contacted by the Australian newspaper with respect to an article where we noted again that there is a funding gap in 2020, a spokesman for Ms Macklin told the Australian Labor had, quote, stopped caring, bothering about explaining Labor's funding of the scheme. How utterly extraordinary. Mind you, a lie as big as the one that you had funded the gap.
Minister will withdraw that word. The Minister can come back to the dispatch box. The member for Jagga will cease interjecting. I know it's under provocation, but the Minister will withdraw that unparliamentary term.
I do withdraw, Mr Speaker. It is not true that the Labor government, when in government, fully funded the NDIS. It is not true that they delivered 4 surpluses in one night. It is simply not true. And when pushed for explanation, how utterly extraordinary that the best that they could come up with is that they'd stopped caring or bothering about explaining Labor's funding of the scheme. And why would you keep peddling that utter myth? You would have to try and stop bothering or caring when the nonsense is as large and the myth is as large as the one that they've propagated. What we announced today is that we will find savings measures to fully fund the NDIS. We are the government who will give line of sight. And had you been serious about fully funding the NDIS, you would have done exactly the same thing that we are doing, and that is create an account into which the savings will go, where they will be protected and allocated only for the purposes of funding the NDIS.
Just before I call the member for O'Connor, I'd also like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon the former member for Durack, Mr Barry Hass. On behalf of the House, welcome back. The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister outline to the House how affordable and reliable energy supports Australian exports? How would alternative approaches jeopardise the prosperity of hard-working Australian exporters and energy reliability?
The Minister for Trade and Investment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for O'Connor for the question, because, like all those on this side of the House, I know he's passionate about boosting Australian job opportunities by growing our export sector. And he's right. The fact is that Australian exports have flourished under this coalition government. And they flourished because it's the coalition government that's put in place 3 powerhouse free trade agreements with key North Asian markets like South Korea, Japan and China. And in fact, Mr Speaker, the value of Australia's exports reached some $32.6 billion in December, the highest level ever in our nation's history. And in fact, it resulted in a record export performance of a trade surplus of some $3.5 billion, which also is in fact the largest that was ever recorded. Over 2015-16, our net exports contributed to over half of Australia's economic growth, in contributing some 1.4% out of a growth rate of some 2.7%. So what these results show is a clear vindication of this government's efforts with respect to pursuing trade agreements that are good for Australia, good for Australian workers, and of course will also be good for Australian wages. In large part, our airport exports have been driven by increased services exports and large increases in Australian energy exports of LNG and coal. Now, this is the same LNG and coal sector that provides the low-cost energy that's critical to Australia retaining its export competitiveness. And so, while Australia is the world's biggest coal exporter, with exports expected to be around $58 billion in 2016-17, according to the Minerals Council, we want to make sure as a government that government policy is committed to ensuring continued growth in the sector and continued jobs. So you'd expect, with that growth in the sector, that the Labor Party might be a little bit more committed to it. You'd expect that the Leader of the Opposition, for example, would be a little bit more focused on backing clean coal technologies like those on this side of the chamber are. But the problem is that the Leader of the Opposition doesn't care about coal miners. He doesn't care about those regional communities. In fact, he's more concerned about kale than he is about coal. That's what his focus is. His focus is about what he can do for those that would rather eat kale in the inner cities than what it is he can do about coal miners in regional Australia. The fact is that Australians can see straight through this Leader of the Opposition. They know a phony when they see one. And let me tell you, Mr Speaker, they can always spot a counterfeit bill. They can spot a counterfeit bill from a long way away. And when you look through a magnifying glass, what they can see about the opposition is that they have failed policies, policies that aren't good for Australian workers, and they'll turn their back on our trade and export agenda.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister specifically confirm that on the day after the blackout in South Australia last year, a conference call between the Prime Minister's office, the Energy Minister's office and Environment and Energy officials was told, and I quote, Australian energy market operators' advice is that the generation mix, i.e. renewable or fossil fuel, was not to blame for yesterday's event. It was the loss of 1,000 megawatts of power in such a short space of time as transmission lines fell over.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, nothing better illuminates the delusion of the Labor Party than that question. They are in a state of denial, complete state of denial. Let's go to the Australian Energy Market Operators Report. And what does it say? Talking about the growing proportion of variable renewables in the South Australian grid, that is to say wind and solar. The growing proportion of this type of generating plant within the generation portfolio is leading to more periods with low inertia and low available fault levels, hence a lower resilience to extreme events. That's what AEMO says. The reality is, of course it wasn't the windmill that caused the transmission line to fall down. Nobody said it was. But what happened was typical of the lazy, negligent, complacent Labor government. They introduced more and more variable renewables into the mix, increasing the vulnerability of the transmission network, increasing the lack of resilience of the network, as AEMO has said, and when the storm came, the network went down. If the power station at Port Augusta had been operating,
the Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the question goes to one issue only, which is asking the Prime Minister whether he received a specific piece of advice. There's nothing else in the question other than asking whether or not he received that. We quoted the advice in the question.
Yes, I've been members on my right. The Prime Minister is relevant to the subject of the question. and he's not drifting off the policy subject to the question. The Prime Minister is in order.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the AEMO's advice has been consistent always with what is in their report, and that report is exactly as I read it. The fact is you have much more wind in South Australia than you have in other states. As a result, you need to have more backup power, more storage, but the South Australian Labor government didn't bother getting around to that. So they became more and more reliant on the interconnector of Victoria, where they are busily drawing down brown coal-fired power, I might say. What an extraordinary irony. Look, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that the Labor Party has lost the plot on energy. Now, they can continue pounding away. We can see them, led by the Leader of the Opposition, to the light on the hill. There they are, the legions of the Labor loyalists. They're going there on their way to the light on the hill. Through the darkness of the night, the light is there. It's still, there's not a sound, but then you hear, softly at first, but then louder and louder, the chug, chug, chug of the backup generator, because that's what you need to power the light on the hill or anywhere in South Australia nowadays. They have been sacrificed, the people of South Australia, on the altar of Labor's incompetence and ideology.
Member for Isaacs is warned. The member for Grey, or the Leader of the Opposition, seeking to
leave to table the FOI, which reveals the direct opposite of what the Prime Minister just said to the House.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Small Business. Will the Minister update the House on action the government is taking to protect small businesses from the impact of unreliable and expensive electricity? What hurdles stand in the way of achieving energy security for hard-working Australian businesses?
The Minister for Small Business.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I thank the member for Grey for his very important question, Mr. Speaker. We have heard in this question time today from the Prime Minister, as well as from the Minister for Environment and Energy, how this federal government will take the ideology out of the energy debate and give South Australian small business, Mr. Speaker, the certainty it deserves and the affordable energy it needs. Now, the member for Grey and I have spoken many times about how important small business is. He is a passionate South Australian. He represents 90% of the geographic area of his state. There are 11,884 small businesses in the member for Grey's electorate. Those small businesses expect, they deserve, that when they flick the switch, the power will come on. Mr. Speaker, energy security is vital for small business. The members for Grey, for Barker, for Boothby and for Sturt know how just essential it is for small businesses to have the power at their fingertips, not just when the wind blows, not just when the sun shines, but every single minute of every single day. City or country, coastal or inland, there are lights, fridges which need to be switched on, cash registers, EFTPOS machines, computers and other technology on which small businesses rely. Small businesses deserve and affordable baseload power on which they can rely, just like the communities which rely upon them. Now, when the farms and family businesses of Grey and the rest of South Australia were plunged into darkness again last Wednesday, for the 8th time I might add in recent months, South Australian small business was left counting the cost of picking up the tab. Fridges and freezers left to defrost, thousands of dollars of stock now destined for the dump. Now, Mr. Speaker, a couple of McDonald's outlets employing 150 people, many of them young people. Their energy costs have gone up almost double, by $50,000 each. This is in the member for Grey's electorate, and even after the owner spent capital on trying to reduce power usage. Another one employs 90 people, an annual payroll of $1.2 million. Their electricity bill increased 59% year-on-year, January to January. Sadly, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Labor energy policy is, would you like a blackout with that? Would you like a blackout with that? The Labor Party's federal shadow minister, the member for Port Adelaide, the national president of the ALP no less, called it a hiccup. Tell that to the small businesses in South Australia. You tell that to the small businesses in South Australia. Little regard for perished produce, few mentions of failing technology, just one sorry blame game. One sorry blame game by the South Australian Labor government, by its twin here in Canberra. Mr Speaker, the policies of those opposite, just like their leader, are unreliable.
Members on both sides, the Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Today we've learned through freedom of information that the Commonwealth Government was directly advised about the blackout in South Australia last year, and I quote, "Australian energy market operators' advice is that the generation mix, i.e. renewable or fossil fuel, was not to blame." Why then, on the exact same day of receiving this advice, did the Prime Minister and his Energy Minister blame renewable energy for the blackout?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the inability of the Leader of the Opposition to do anything other than misrepresent is extraordinary. He has no capacity for correlating his remarks here with the facts on any occasion. He says whatever he thinks will suit him. The truth is, as we know, as the AEMO said in their report, that the change to having such a large amount of variable renewable power, wind turbines in the main, meant that the grid in South Australia had, and I quote, a lower resilience to extreme events. So, Mr Speaker, certainly nobody is suggesting that there was a solar panel that caused the storm, or that the extreme wind event was caused by an errant wind turbine going at excessive speed. We all know that. But the reality is the South Australian Labor government introduced a massive amount of renewables into their grid and did not plan for the consequences. That's the fact. That's what AEMO says. Now, Mr Speaker, it is perfectly obvious that what was done was mindless and negligent and incompetent. They made South Australia more and more reliant on Victoria and the interconnectors with Victoria. They allowed to have closed down a baseload power, a coal-fired power at Port Augusta. They had gas-fired power stations that were not operating. The reality is they put all of their bet on renewable energy and failed to recognise it has certain consequences. There's nothing wrong with wind farms. There's nothing wrong with solar panels. They're great. They play an important role. But they don't work all the time. They don't work all the time, and you've got to plan for it. That's why you need storage. That's why you need backup. That's why you need better transmission networks. You need to put in place those measures. And the absurdity of the Labor Party's position, their delusion, is that in the midst of all of the hardship they've inflicted on families and businesses in South Australia, the member for Port Adelaide stands up and describes it as a hiccup. It's just a hiccup. Just a little hiccup that your business is shut down, you've got to lay off your workers. Just a little hiccup that you can't turn the air conditioner on in a 40-degree day. Just a little hiccup that all of your fishing catch is going off because you can't run your refrigerators. Talk about out of touch. The Labor Party is lost on this issue. This is a test of competence, and they have failed.
The member for CORANGAMITE.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Sport. Will the Minister update the House on recent listings to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme? How do these recent listings support hard-working Australian families and reduce cost of living pressures?
The Minister for Health and Sport.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for CORANGAMITE, who has long been an advocate for families of children with cystic fibrosis, along with many members of this House, including in particular the member for Forrest, and also I want to acknowledge the member for Farrer, who worked long and hard over many, many months to help families with cystic fibrosis. In that context, I particularly want to note that it was an honour and a privilege to be able to join the member for CORANGAMITE in visiting families from Cystic Fibrosis Australia outside Parliament House last Wednesday. Whilst we were there, we were able to make the announcement that the drug Kalydeco will be listed on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. As a consequence of that, families who would otherwise have had to have paid up to $300,000 a year will be able to access life-saving drugs for children between 2 and 5 years of age. It was previously available for children over that age, but that has now been extended to children between 2 and 5 years of age inclusive. That $300,000 for families of and parents such as those of young Dash, we met those parents, is money which could never have been found. It is money which is exactly the sort of thing that a government should be doing through its healthcare system, providing for those who are least capable with the most important needs. These children's lives will be profoundly different as a result. In addition to that, this is Ovarian Cancer Month, and I have also been fortunate to be able to list the drug olaparib on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. That drug would ordinarily have cost $100,000. It will now be made available to over 230 women who face the terrible scourge of ovarian cancer. It is likely to improve the quality of their life significantly. It is likely to extend the quality of their lives by a number of years. It is not a cure at this stage, and so medical research is fundamental. Other decisions that we've been able to make in the last few weeks include drugs for lung cancer, drugs for other areas. In some cases, again, saving families $100,000 a year. So that is what comes about through careful and a sustainable combination of 4 pillars. A commitment to universal access for Medicare and pharmaceuticals, firstly. Secondly, a commitment to universal access through our hospitals. Thirdly, a focus on mental health and preventive health. And fourthly, a focus on medical research. So there is more to be done on the medical research to extend the range of outcomes and treatments which can subsequently be listed. But these drugs have been able to be listed because of the combination of medical research coupled with sensible, prudent budget management, which gives us the ability to save lives and to improve lives exactly as our health system should be doing.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer, and I also refer to the Australian newspaper this morning, which reveals that the highest price rises for electricity over the past decade occurred in the 3 states with the highest reliance on coal power and the lowest reliance on renewables: New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. How does the Prime Minister explain these massive price rises when he can't blame renewable energy?
Leader of the House, the member for Hughes, will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I thank the honourable member for his latest hiccup on energy. Mr Speaker, the honourable member is trying to apologise feebly and shift blame away from what is a fundamental failure of the Labor government in South Australia. Let's be very clear about this. It is obvious from the AEMO's work, it's been obvious for a long time. If you go back to the work of the South Australia Renewables Council, you'll see this point about the vulnerability of the network as more renewables are introduced has been flagged for a long time. But nothing has been done by the Labor government. They put all of their hopes on continuing to suck more electricity out of Victoria, which ironically is generated by burning brown coal, the most emissions-intensive form of baseload generation in Australia. Now, the reality is that this has been a failure of Labor Party government. It's been an exercise in incompetence, and all of the excuses in the world can't get Labor off the hook.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat for a second. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Speaker. I waited a while, but I wonder whether the Prime Minister, to be directly relevant, might touch on the price rises in those 3 states.
I thank the member for Port Adelaide. The Prime Minister's in order. The member's question certainly did have a specific element, but it also referred to previous answers, and the Prime Minister's on the policy topic.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The South Australia has, as the honourable member knows, the most expensive electricity in Australia. And worse still, it is the least reliable. So it is not only putting businesses at risk and jobs at risk because it is so expensive. The fact that it isn't reliable means that businesses have to invest in generator capacity, as they said when I was in the member for Grey's electorate in Port Lincoln, as though we were living in a third-world country where you've got to invest millions of dollars in diesel backup generators to ensure that you've got your fridges going and your business going. It has been a colossal failure of government by the South Australian Labor Party. And why? How did they get into that problem? Mr Speaker, it's very simple. They introduced a very large percentage of wind power into the state. They failed to recognise that it has different characteristics to baseload power. They did not put in place the storage or the backup mechanisms to support it. And frankly, they acted mindlessly and carelessly and incompetently, and South Australians are paying the cost. And that is exactly the same approach that the Labor Party has taken federally with their reduction targets, with their renewable targets. They have not thought this through at all. They've demonstrated yet again their incompetence, their negligence, their complacency, the fact that they will always put politics and ideology ahead of the management and the careful discipline of government that Australians expect from those who seek to lead them.
The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the Minister inform the House why it is important to bring a consistent and well-thought-out approach to the reform of donations in election campaigns? How does a considered approach to donations reform maintain the integrity of our system?
The Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Groom for his question. And it is important, of course, to reform foreign donations to political parties in this country, and that's why the Prime Minister at the National Press Club on the 1st of February said, "Australians expect us to ensure that only Australians can seek to influence Australian elections, whether via a political party, an activist group like Get Up, or an association or union." And so the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, came into the chamber today to play catch-up with the government, to play catch-up with the Prime Minister, who's been talking about electoral reform for the last 10 years since he entered the parliament. And the Leader of the Opposition introduced a private member's bill today on foreign donations, Mr Speaker. Well, it doesn't surprise me because the Labor Party knows a lot about foreign donations. I'm not talking about the Bath Party in 1977, Mr Speaker. I'm talking about much more recent political history. Because in 13-15, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party received $4 million worth of foreign donations from China alone, and the Coalition only received $2 million. So, in fact, Labor received double the level of foreign donations than the Coalition received in 13-15. But there's more, Mr Speaker, of course. They know quite a bit about foreign donations because Senator Sam Dastyari's career went under the bus because he thought it was perfectly reasonable for Chinese businesses to pay his personal debts. And of course, Mr Senator Dastyari resigned, but apparently all is forgiven because he was brought back to the front bench last week. So all was forgiven. Six months in Coventry, now he's back on the front bench of the Labor Party again. So, Mr Speaker, we're not going to be lectured by the Labor Party on foreign donations or electoral reform of any kind, and not by this Leader of the Opposition who entirely forgot a $40,000 donation from Unibuilt for his 2007 election campaign until he had to appear in the Hayden Royal Commission 9 years later, and then suddenly he remembered it again and updated his register a few days before he had to appear in the Royal Commission, Mr Speaker. So we won't be lectured by the Labor Party on electoral reform, not especially when you analyse the Leader of the Opposition's bill and discover that his bill would still allow the Chinese businesses who gave Labor $1.355 million in 2013 to continue to do so, and not when you realise that the Labor Party's bill would still allow Senator Dastyari's personal debts to be paid by Chinese businesses. So what we've introduced here, Mr Speaker, is a smokescreen by the Labor Party to cover their embarrassment about the Leader of the Opposition's lack of credibility, one of his front benches misunderstanding about the ethics of politics and the foreign donations they've been taking for decades from overseas. Don't look at what he says, Mr Speaker, look at what he does.
The Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister.